Claverton. Welcome to Conversing. It's a particularly great joy today to welcome Cherie Harder as our guest on Conversing. Cherie serves as the president of the Trinity Forum. And prior to joining the Trinity Forum in 2008, she served in the White House as special assistant to the president and director of policy and projects for First Lady Laura Bush. Thank you so much, Cherie, for joining us today. I'm eager for our conversation.
I'm looking forward to it.
You know, I think most people who are listening to this are part of that vast crowd of people who are trying to find somebody who knows what they're doing, somebody who actually in the world gets the picture, gets reality, understands things. I'm not setting you up to be the soothsayer of all things, but I am wanting this conversation to happen because I so value you personally and your wisdom and perspective, but also the exceptional work of Trinity Forum, which maybe not everyone who's listening knows well. So I'd like you to begin maybe by just saying a little bit about the Trinity Forum itself and then how it is that you came to join Trinity Forum.
Oh, well, gladly. Thanks for the question. So Trinity Forum has been around for a while, since 1991. Our founders were Oz Guinness and Al McDonald. And the vision has really from the beginning been to cultivate, curate, and disseminate the best of Christian thought, and to provide a space where leaders can wrestle with the big questions of life in the context of faith. And so we try to do that. We try to cultivate and disseminate the best of Christian thought for the common good. And there's probably three areas that we focus on, which would be faith and public life, the arts and humanities, as well as spiritual formation. And we sort of seek to explore those areas through a variety of programs such as in-person events, virtual webinars and online conversations, reading groups, Socratic forums. And then we also publish quarterly readings where we try to take some of the best of literature and letters and add discussion questions in the back so that it's sort of teed up for small group or book club use. And literature that's all chosen because it does raise those big questions of life. And, you know, ultimately all big questions are spiritual questions. So not all of our authors are sort of explicitly Christian. You know, Viktor Frankl with Man's Search for Meaning may not be coming from, you know, an orthodox Christian worldview, but raises huge questions that I think are, that if our faith doesn't necessarily offer answers to, it points us towards the author of the answers who offers himself. And so part of what we're hoping to do is to, you know, essentially kind of set the table for those kind of conversations and be able to curate and invite people in to hear from some of the most thoughtful, faithful people out there on a wide variety of subjects.
Well, I do think that one of the things that sets you up for a fascinating perspective on what's going on in culture is this work of the Trinity Forum. And the Trinity Forum occupies, in my mind, a space that feels like it's a third space, that it's informed by things academic, but it's not an academic institution. It's formed by things that are public in politics, society, culture, and so forth, and yet it's not really only those things. It's affected by the church and people in the church, Christians in all of these various domains. So you have this very interesting bird's eye picture, it seems to me, of people who are doing the work that they've been called to, who are for the most part, people given to deep Christian reflection, who then want to consider what those things mean in relationship to the bigger questions of life, which is what you've just said. And I guess I'm just wanting to reflect back how much I value the work of Trinity Forum, would commend it to anyone. We will put the link to Trinity Forum in the notes. So anybody who wants to follow up further with all of the resources that you provide that are now only expanding, partly because, like so many things, because of the pandemic, you have new avenues of being able to benefit from the ministry and work of Trinity Forum. What was it, do you think, for you personally that made this a natural fit? Because it certainly seems to me to be a very natural fit.
Well, that's really kind to say. To the outside, it might have seemed, my coming to the Trinity Forum might have seemed like a bit of a jump, and that my background was really as a bit of a policy wonk. I worked on Capitol Hill, worked at the National Endowment for the Humanities, worked at a think tank and at the White House before coming to the Forum. And I'd always been a huge fan of the Forum and had been involved, as a mentor on the advisory board or what have you. But one of the things that I think part of the reason why I was so excited about it is it did seem like it was an important, if relatively obscure forum for the kind of thinking that you just described. And in many ways, that kind of thought is largely upstream from a lot of politics, a lot of sociology, certainly our current mess. It's not that culture is always upstream from politics. Sometimes there's a bit of a whirlpool, that goes on.
Right.
But a lot of the ideas that we just breathe in and become at the level of assumptions shouldn't be. They're actually deep ideas, sometimes dubious ideas, real world views, kind of premises that perhaps should be explored or questioned, interrogated, that are often just, again, assumed or taken for granted. And things can reach a certain saturation where one does not even recognize the fact that one is assuming it, one's taking it for assumption. It's just sort of like a given. And sort of I saw in my previous posts, whether on Capitol Hill or at the White House or at a think tank, how certain ideas would take shape and how some ideas were deliberately cultivated. And sometimes in fairly blunt and even fairly ugly ways. I mean, part of what propaganda is, of course, is, essentially kind of hitting a people over the head with an idea and just sort of bludgeoning them into submission. And the scary thing is it so often works. And so one of my, I guess, just real areas of interest was how do some of these ideas take shape? And as a person of faith who believes that we worship the author of truth, what role should we be playing to at least have discussions? Question together, think together. Thinking is a relational exercise, and is there something unique we can offer in terms of setting the table for that kind of critical thinking. And along with that, not just thinking alone, but again, because thinking is relational, there's a community development aspect of this too. People who are, who do want to think and explore together. And so there has been, I grew up in a somewhat fundamentalist household. There's been a healthy anti-intellectual strain through much of Christendom, certainly much of evangelicalism. And so thought there was really something that might be missing and something of great value that the Forum could offer.
Yes. Well, I know that one of the things that was a benefit in its founding was Os Guinness's role, partly because he was from outside the U.S. and from England, and therefore had a really different perspective in certain ways than many people inside American culture. And part of his purchase, as it were, of how he came to see society and culture was a benefit to all of us because he had a somewhat more distinct angle of vision. And I think out of that began the grist then that is the work of Trinity Forum. It is both cultivating, it's deeply seeding thought and action, but it's also a place that has this richness and variety of perspectives as it has grown and unfolded, which makes it just such a fertile ground for, I think, a lot of people who don't know really where to turn to get the depth of content and interaction and community that can happen. And certainly for people that live in Washington, D.C., where they can actually physically attend Trinity Forum events, that community is even more vivid, I suppose you could say. But I think all of that is just such a beautiful picture of why Trinity Forum matters. What do you think are, as you are constantly in conversation with people, I'm sure just implicitly or explicitly asking the question, what is going on in this crazy time? That's what I meant about people wandering around looking for somebody who knows what is happening or knows where they are or has an understanding and a perspective that they want to hear. What would you say if you were to choose three things that you think are the primary things that you're hearing from people these days through the work of the Trinity Forum that are at the top of the list of the things that are, quote, going on?
Oh, that's a great question, Mark. And, I should say which is exactly what you said. One of the things that's so much fun about the work that I get to do is I do get to listen to some of the most thoughtful people on the planet, yourself included. I know you were a guest not too long ago, but yes, that is a great opportunity. And it's hard to kind of summarize or synthesize because goodness knows there's a lot. Kind of where do we start? One of the things I would say, and unfortunately this is true of Christians as well as others, is we are looking for our identity in the wrong places. As a subset of that, our identities are becoming increasingly politicized as our politics becomes increasingly apocalyptic. And just to kind of drill down on that a little bit, just a few decades ago, it was quite common to marry outside of your party and quite rare to marry outside of your faith. Apparently, that has now flipped. So a decision as sort of personal and as identity forming and reinforcing as your choice of spouse, increasingly one's partisan affiliation is ranked more valuable, more central, more important than one's faith commitment. And I think that says a lot in terms of just how we think about ourselves and our obligations and our commitments and who we are. And as our identities are becoming more political, our politics is, getting far more, extreme, more polarized, more angry, less liberal. And I by liberal, I don't mean progressive left. I mean, kind of open,
right.
Sort of inviting, pluralistic, that sort of thing. So essentially, we're being divided along a line that has become increasingly toxic and apocalyptic. And I think a second thing that has gone on, and it's related to the first, is that not only are we getting more of our identity in partisanship, we're getting more of our sense of meaning from partisan combat. And that, I think, you see daily examples of. But, for the Christian, our meaning should be grounded in something very different than a partisan victory. But one is seeing in some areas sort of a conflation of political domination with, say, the triumph of the gospel. So, a triumphalism, particularly toxic kind of triumphalism that's kind of being in some ways baptized or sacralized. So I think that's a second just sort of serious factor in what has gone on. And still related to that, I do think the rise of what's been called affective polarization is also plays a role in all of this, and that's the idea that as groups gather, the consensus tends to be skewed towards the most extreme version of the common point of agreement. And so you see that in political primaries where the primary candidate, the way people talk in primaries, is always more extreme than the way they talk in the general. But you're seeing that in groups, in virtually kind of all discussions. So different groups are getting more radicalized in their view. And, somewhat related to that is so much of our conversation, our communication, our discourse is increasingly not only mediated through social media, but increasingly kind of conformed to the structures, the norms, the ways of being of social media. It's sort of unheard of to walk into a room and just sort of start denouncing people. But then that's what we do all the time, online. And, the norms of online communication have proved more sticky, more spreadable, more contagious than the norms of in-person communication and relationship. There's many other things we could say, but those are three biggies to start us off.
They are very big. All three of those really are very significant, and each of them plays in such an interactive way with the other two, right? So it is very much an interplay. When I think about the identity questions, one of the things that is especially concerning to me about AI is the fact that it creates an opportunity for even greater identity confusion at an extraordinary pace without a clarity, although I know people are working on this, but without the clarity of knowing what's real, let alone what's true. And in that mix, there's just the potential for so much worse circumstances. Now, I am not a Luddite. I do believe that AI has tremendous positive capacity and is already influencing our lives in positive ways and will even more so in the future, but not because it is without entailments that are hugely difficult and I think will be emerging, are already emerging, and will continue to emerge. So if you add that into the identity politics, what do you make of that? I'm just curious.
Oh, I'm somewhat terrified. Yeah.
Touche. Let's just name the raw terror. Yes.
I think that's a huge point, Ed. You mentioned essentially trust or knowing what's real. And we are at kind of a new point in that, for the last, 200 plus years, in America, the oldest kind of working democracy or constitutional republic, we've had ideas about pluralism to kind of help guide us through what happens when there are deep disagreements about the good, about what's good or bad, better or worse, more valuable or less valuable, and those kind of both norms and structures of pluralism kind of help us to at least a certain extent act together, even if we think differently.
Yes.
But we're now actually kind of entering a time, or have entered a time, where it's not just disagreements about what's good or bad, better or worse, wise or unwise, but what's real versus unreal, true versus false.
Right.
And even without the help of AI, that has been a big driver of some of the worst and kind of most toxic conflict over the last several years.
Right.
You see it with a rise of conspiracy thinking. I mean, it's shocking, but apparently, around 25% of self-reported evangelicals, and I use the self-reported adjective intentionally, affirm some aspect of the Q conspiracy theory.
Astounding.
There's plenty of other conspiracies kind of floating around there, but we're all fallen creatures. We're all susceptible to. We want to believe certain things. We're all again susceptible to motivated reasoning, and this is only going to increase. And one of the things that's been remarkable to me is, we've seen people who don't believe something even though they can see it. A political figure says, "I never said that," and there's all this video available of him saying that, and yet people are still like, "I believe him." And you think, what happens when deep fakes are actually really convincing and you can see it with your own eyes? The record can be changed or erased or, completely recreated. So, I think we are in new territory here.
Yeah. When you think about the time you've spent in D.C. and the social dynamics that have always been present in D.C., especially though when you compare where we are now to where things were when you first started, I think it would be interesting to hear you comment on how the dynamics that you've just described in these three major movements have shaped just the lived daily experience of being in D.C. How is it different now to try to be an agent of good in such an important place and time?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. And I guess I'm going to reveal just how long in the tooth I am here. So I came to D.C. right after graduating in 1991. And one of my first jobs was working as a legislative correspondent for Senator Jack Danforth. And among my issue areas that I covered were judicial affairs, which meant that one of my first jobs as a 22-year-old was answering all of the Clarence Thomas mail. So, right from the get-go, was sort of plunged into one of the most sort of, most difficult, most painful, and most sort of deeply divisive conflicts, of the time. But there was a real difference in how people, at least within D.C., as painful as that whole conflict was, and confusing, to a lot of people, myself included. Who does one believe, and
Absolutely.
What exactly happened, and
Yes.
At the same time, staffers on the Hill and senators had to work with each other. They couldn't just snipe at each other in social media. They actually had to negotiate face-to-face. There had to be an agreement over when to have a vote. Mm-hmm. Senate rules are largely set up such that the minority can kind of, or even one person can really gum up the works. The rules in the House kind of allow the majority to stick it to the minority. In the Senate, it's quite different. So in the Senate, they had to deal with each other, and they had to find a way to air the arguments and have the vote and decide to move on. And even just a few years later, like in 1996, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had been the head of the ACLU, which was, anathema to a lot of conservative senators, was confirmed by a 96-4 vote.
Right. Amazing.
And Scalia had gotten a very high vote, on the other side, and it wasn't like any mystery about where his. He's a very articulate guy, never, held back. So, there was a certain amount of, I was going to say deference, but of just kind of obedience to an unenforced norm, which was, if you're the president, that's actually, the Constitution says you get that pick, unless there was a reason why, they were not qualified or their character was unsuited to it. Parties tended to, basically, vote to confirm.
Right.
And so there were more norms that were observed. I heard once that I think it was like Edmund Burke who talked about how civilization depends on obedience to the unenforceable. And there were, like I said, there
Right.
weren't official means of enforcement, but they were norms that others observed. And in addition, people tended to live in D.C. more, which, again, is in some quarters kind of anathema. But the upshot of that is you knew people. You went to the same church, or you rode on the metro together. Your kids went to school together. You played in softball leagues, and it's hard to entirely demonize a large chunk of your opponents when you're regularly rubbing shoulders with them.
Yes.
And so there was just, it was different in that sense, in that On one hand, there were a lot of areas where there was less transparency. There was more that happened, I guess in the proverbial smoke-filled room, although at that point people weren't smoking, but the closed-door room, there were deals that got made and agreements that got hashed out. Whereas now so much is out in the open. But another thing that has happened now is because it's not only possible, but easy and and positively reinforced to not actually engage in the hard act of trying to come to an agreement, but instead retreating and just sniping via social media at your opponent. That in essence, the kind of retreat from responsibility is rewarded. And so we're getting a lot more of it than we used to.
Target practice is always better done from a distance, and it's easily done because of that. It's really quite concerning for so many different reasons because it's a common phrase that especially digital natives will say, no, it's as natural to me to be on the phone or to be on a screen talking to my friend or my neighbor or my colleague as it is to do anything else. But in actual fact, I get that it's been normed. So it is as normative that I can have an encounter with a person on a screen as it is normative that I could have a personal encounter with someone in person. But that's very different than saying they're the same thing, and they just aren't the same thing, and they require and understandably reflect different sorts of risks and different sorts of rules of engagement, which, as you say, many of which are unenforceable in person, but which are inconsequential and therefore all the more distant when you're doing them online. So this is a truism, of course. Many people have observed all this. It's just that to say so much is at stake that the methodology of this communication is figuring so substantially in the problem itself. I'm Mark Labberton. You're listening to Conversing. Cherie, when you think about the perspectives of men and women, I'm curious, so much has happened that has justified and brought forth the tremendously important contribution of women in politics, society, and culture in general. And yet we also live in this bizarre time when there's so much division. And I'm just curious, as you think about the angle of women's voice as both constructive and or destructive, do you distinguish it from what you observe about how men are participating in this? Because certainly in normal cultural patterns, there tends to be a difference.
That's such an interesting question. I don't know that I've thought about it in quite those terms, but I love the question. And, one thing I think I will say is there does seem to be, in some ways, social media has a way of exploiting some of the worst stereotypical tendencies of both men and women. With women, again, we're trafficking in stereotypes here, but but just in terms of the aggregate, I think there's a good reason why our Jonathan Haidt talks about how it is teenage girls in particular who where depression and suicide attempts have just skyrocketed since 2009, which was the year that the majority of teenagers had smartphones. And, a lot of female aggression is social rather than physical. We're less likely to kind of get into a brawl. We express aggression largely through gossip. And boy, social media can puts that on rocket boosters. And, it makes it possible to essentially have no natural limits to when the gossip ends, in that when you're communicating face to face, a change of scene means an end to the most part of your experience of being bullied or snubbed or talked about behind your back, at least as far as you're aware of it. But whatever the social medium is, it can just there's no end. It can just continue and it can spread, and so humiliation is before a much larger audience without the natural limits.
Right.
With men, I think one of the natural tendency towards aggression. Boy, do we see that, in social media. And our mutual friend David French. It's incredible the amount of death threats that he gets. We both know him to be a very a delightful, charming, enthusiastic, and gracious guy. And good grief. To essentially express an opinion, it doesn't even have to be overly provocative, is to invite, a fair amount of online abuse.
Yes.
And usually it's not women who are threatening to kill other people. This is coming, from men for the most part. So I think there's a way in which the medium kind of just offers new opportunities and takes away limits to some of the worst, aspects of gendered communication.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things that strikes me about the moment that we're in and that makes Trinity Forum, again, such a valuable resource is that it is able to convene gatherings of unexpected people sometimes and have conversations across disciplines, across sectors of society and culture, across worldviews. And the richness of that is really significant. Now, so here's my question. Sometimes when I'm in those settings, I feel like I'm looking for that Archimedean point where I could somehow stand and get sufficient purchase to gather up the right elements and to want to move something forward that would actually feel like it was fair to reality, fair to real politics that's going on, but also constructive and productive and so forth. So for a minute, I want you to just imagine that you had the influence to be able to gather just such an effort together. And if from where you sit and as you see the issues, if you could gather up the right people, what would the topic be that you would think is one of the most important things that kind of convergence could be built around? And then what would you hope would be the outcome? So what is the topic? What would be the outcome if you could foster what you consider to be one of the most important of these kinds of conversations?
Oh, wow. These are great questions, Mark. First, I think I'd want to give more thought to that. But, one topic that does occur to me that I would love to see more conversation about, there certainly has been some, but I think much more needs to be done, is that, we're at a point where I do think there's a fraying consensus, a damaged, consensus that is in danger of unraveling around liberal democracy, which is, has enabled all, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the ordered liberty that has made it possible to flourish, to worship freely, and to attempt to persuade our neighbors, the very, we can talk about persuasion in a second, but, that makes it possible. And I see so much of the criticism and a lot of the undermining coming from within the church. It is one thing that I would love to kind of be able to sort of set the table for, and not just stay at the table, but, ultimately for there to be more work done in the area around the Christian case for liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. I think there's I hear louder voices. I saw one post the other day arguing for a Protestant Franco, thinking that somehow if we just seize power, if we just kind of control things, we can force feed goodness on others, and flourishing will be the result. And well, there's so much that can be said about that, but I think we have so much to be grateful for, that as many things that have gone wrong in our country, both over our history and now, and there is never going to be a utopia among fallen people, ever. There will always be injustice, but and things to reform. But I also just feel like there's a deep cause for gratitude, and there's something precious being devalued and in danger of being lost. And would love to call more of the faithful to a proper, not just appreciation of it, but support for it.
Right. That's really substantial, Cherie. The challenges that raises really have a lot to do with character, a lot to do with social location, a lot to do with the fact that we're in a time when it feels like the delicate things, by which I'm not really meaning fragile, but the delicate things that require true care and patience and thoughtfulness and sustained concentration, and I could go on. That list is, and that way of being is threatened by all kinds of aspects of culture that feel aggressive and domineering and wanting to take control of things that would then homogenize in a certain direction. And as you say, tragically, the church itself has so many examples of this emerging. It's interesting on this day we are having the conversation, is also the day when Pat Robertson passed away. And Pat Robertson, as one of the earliest televangelists, was given, as we both know, to declarations of meaning and consequences of various kinds, drawing connections between various actions in culture and society to what he understood to be God's judgment across America, or anyone or anything else that he felt that should pertain to. Now, that in several of the obituaries that I've read today, that's been one of the things that has been said about him. The other thing that's been said about him, though, from people that I have some contact with, are people who are describing him not that way, but as a person that they just know as a person, and not the kind of big public voice that makes declarations about who's going to hell. So what's interesting about that is that the personal descriptions, of course, don't see any of that other public stuff as the description of Pat Robertson, right? They see just the person that they knew as a friend or a neighbor or whatever. But Pat Robertson and you and I and everyone else are both of those two things, potential at any given moment. And the culture is feeding one system so thickly, for the reasons we've been discussing, that the deeper reality of who a person is and what pain they bear and why they would be motivated and how they came to such a position of being unable to tolerate anything other than the primary banner that they want to operate under, suggests to me that they are not listening carefully enough, that we are not listening carefully enough to the gospel, that we're not listening carefully enough to the life and ministry of Jesus, that we're instead much more prone to ramrodding things than we are to any kind of delicacy. So I'm just wondering if that is descriptive of the world you see, or if you would modify that description in some way.
No, I think it's a great description. And, just to kind of sort of add a little bit more to it, in some ways it is perfectly understandable that, the temptation to ramrod makes sense because in many ways it works. Right. And, one of the things I've heard over and over from, people who I've been surprised by their actions or their statements in the last few years. I thought they thought one thing, and then, apparently that wasn't the case. And several of them have said something very similar, which was, well, we did that for a while, but it didn't work. and essentially, why wouldn't you act in a way that's effective, that gets results, and
Right.
meet your metrics and the like. And, and frankly, a lot of, reputation, what's seen as organizational effectiveness, is very much kind of tied to certain metrics that are moved by those kind of strategies and tactics. And so if that is your measurement, well, of course you're going to, and it's all oriented towards succeeding. Well, of course you're going to do those things because that's the responsible thing to do, the effective, the successful thing to do. But as you say, one of the great ironies, or something to certainly be grappled with, is, we worship a man who did not. We worship a God who did not simply give us a creed to follow, but said to follow Him and to walk in His way.
Yes.
There's a way that one is supposed to follow, to act, to marinate in.
Yes.
And, straying from the path is a constant temptation, and goodness knows, it's one for me too, so it's not like perfection here at all. But, there's there's just a certain irony that the God who held Himself up as an example modeled a way completely at odds with what tends to work in a political campaign. What works is vilifying and humiliating your opponent, showing them to be weak, to be silly, laughing at them. Jesus did exactly the opposite. What works, is to destroy your enemies.
Right.
Jesus said to love your enemies. The way of the gospel is it doesn't seem to make sense in the calculus of our time, probably not in the calculus of any time. And yet that is the God that we worship, who showed us how to do it.
So, Cherie, when you say that, which I'm inspired by, give us, as we close, an example of a conversation, an exchange, progress, something that you would see as an exemplary sign of hope in the midst of the world that you're living in, the work that you're doing with Trinity Forum. What would be a moment when you organize something, experience something together through your work in which you'd say, yeah, we need more of that, like that thing right there, that is really a hopeful sign?
Mm-hmm. I know that there are a number of friendships that happen where there's a deep relationship there, and there has been just real beauty in people loving each other across political divides and caring for each other's person, for each other's family. There have been instances, politically even, years ago when I was still involved in politics and policy, where important things happened that actually did require people to sort of put aside their own hopes for credit,
mm-hmm. Right.
Their own hopes for glory. There was even some pain involved, but there have been some really important milestones in our history, as well as ones that aren't known about as much. Small things. One huge thing that full disclosure, I worked for President Bush and Laura Bush. What President Bush did with PEPFAR was utterly remarkable and saved literally millions of lives, probably between 10 and 20 million lives in Africa. Didn't get a lot of attention for it. Took a lot of heat for it at the time. It's now seen as like, well, duh, of course.
Yes.
And often great ideas sort of follow that trajectory. Like first,
Yes.
It's like that's ridiculous. Secondly, it's like they're viciously opposed, and third, they're
Yes.
Seen as inevitable and obvious. But there have been like a number of just remarkable things that have happened that are now seen as an inevitable and obvious, which at the time looked like an absolute fool's errand.
Yes.
From Wilberforce's time to PEPFAR and, a lot in between. So, that probably doesn't make for a really detailed story, but I think whether it's It's PEPFAR, the Violence Against Women Act, which first passed when I was working for Sam Brownback, who was one of the most conservative members of the Senate. And his co-sponsor was Paul Wellstone, who was the most liberal member of the Senate. But they worked together to pass something important. And because there were such unusual ideological bedfellows, and one thing I'll say is they had very different governing philosophies, but neither of them were terribly partisan. And I think that was important.
Yeah.
But because it was that range, it was also an implicit invitation for others to join. It's like, come on in, the water's warm kind of thing. And I still think that there is an opportunity for that, for the unusual bedfellows, which takes real bravery, and it takes slings and arrows from your own tribe, and that those are even more painful usually, or more poisonous than the ones from across the chasm. But there's an opportunity, and boy, is there a need for more of that.
Cherie, those are great examples of what a campaign to try to help the church understand the place of liberal democracy because of those very realities you've just described, right? Those are the things that actually make that functionally possible. It still depends on people in the system, but how much that is understood and embraced by them, which I think was embraced by those two senators, using that as an example, that's a very significant thing. And I love the thought that in a grand sense, the work of Trinity Forum, which has many objectives and many projects and concerns and issues that it wants to attend to, certainly one of the underlying issues is that very dream that you have of trying to think what it would mean to try to convene the kinds of conversations sustained over time that could do such a deep and renewing work to our culture overall and to our government as well. So thank you so much, Cherie, for this conversation. It's been a great gift. I pray for God's blessing on you and on the Trinity Forum, and just count it an honor to have had the opportunity to talk.
It's been a real delight to talk with you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Conversing on your favorite podcast app to listen to new episodes as they're released. And please leave a review. Conversing is produced by Peter Laberton and distributed by Fuller Studio.